This is London.
Well, that's probably a familiar sound to older viewers, the BBC World Service on the shortwave bands. And today, the shortwave bands are well populated by ham radio. So you can enjoy ham radio on the shortwave bands. If you've got a small garden, well, let's talk about it. This video is about a very simple HF antenna that you can put into even a small garden. But before we talk about the antenna, I found this recently. Put it up to the camera. It's A2065. That was my shortwave listener call sign. The RSGB used to issue call signs to listeners. I'm not sure what they do now. But because I was under the age of 18, I had to have an associate membership, and I was A2065. There we are. If I was over 18, I had a BRS number, but I wasn't, so there we are. Anyway, I was talking to a ham operator who was about the same age as me, actually, recently, and he was far more into DX than I've ever been. But the interesting thing was that almost all his life he'd been using wire antennas, and despite the fact that he'd been using wire antennas, he'd worked all states, he'd worked all zones, he'd worked DXCC on 5 bands, etc. And it reminded me that even if you can't put up a big mast in your garden with a 3-element Yagi and run a kilowatt of power or whatever, you can still work DX. You have to be a little bit more patient, and also you have to develop the skill, and there is a skill in operating and working DX, which is a complete subject in its own. But what I really want to say to you is that if you've got a small garden and you only put up a wire aerial, you may have to be a little bit more patient. You may have to develop the skills, but you can work DX. Now, at the present, the ham radio bands are not in particularly good shape, shortwave bands that is. We have just passed the bottom of the sunspot cycle. The good news is, over the next 4.5 to 5 years, conditions will gradually improve, and there's already signs of that. 15 metres has been open, 10 metres has been open occasionally, and as we go through this new cycle, those bands, including the 24 megahertz band and the 80 megahertz band, they will start to open up and offer good DX. So you need an antenna in your garden. Well, one of the antennas that we've recently taken into stock is the Vibraplex, and it's got rather a long title. It's the, if I can remember it, it's the EF-80-10-JR-KW. Now the JR, I think, indicates that it's short. It was a term they used to use in antenna descriptions many years ago, particularly Americans. They called it the junior, which often meant low power, but this is not low power, it's simply short. And the KW indicates that it will handle a kilowatt of power. The good thing about this antenna is that it will cover 80 through to 10 metres, and it is only 75 foot long. Now this antenna is an end-fed half wave, and I've done several videos about end-fed half waves, so I'm not going to go too deeply into end-fed half waves, but just perhaps to highlight the difference between an end-fed half wave and your conventional dipole. Now a dipole is a very simple antenna. You can feed it directly with coax. Most operators will tend to put a balun in there. I would recommend a balun simply because it's a means of terminating the antenna and providing a feed point for the coax cable. It also improves the balance of the antenna. But anyway, a dipole is a great antenna to start with, but it has a couple of disadvantages. The first disadvantage is it's basically a single band antenna. Now, yeah, I know that it will work on its third harmonic, and one example of that is 40 meters. On 40 meters, you can also operate the antenna on 21 megahertz, 15 meters, which is the third harmonic. It's not a perfect match, but it does work. But it's really the only example. All the other ham bands, the third harmonic is of no relevance. So basically, apart from that one exception, a dipole is a single band antenna. That's one disadvantage. And the other disadvantage really is that because it's centre fed, the heaviest part of the antenna is in the centre. You've got the coax cable and you've got the balun, and they add weight to the antenna, so the antenna sags in the middle, and it's the middle of the antenna actually which really needs to be as high as possible, because the centre of a dipole is point of maximum current, and the point of maximum current is where most of the radiation takes place. So you need to get that point as high as possible, and of course with a dipole it hangs. And I suppose the other thing is, the practical aspect is that the dangly coax halfway down the garden, and a voice will say to you, why have you got that wretched antenna up, that dangly coax, the dangly bit of wire down the garden, it's getting in my clothesline and I can't mow the lawn, etc, etc. You may have heard that, you may not, but anyway, it is another reason for looking at the end-fed half wave. So let's take a look on the screen at the difference between a dipole and a half wave, because after all, they're both the same length. Let's have a look at the antenna itself first of all. You've got the transformer at the end where you feed it with coax. You've got a small correction coil. As you go up in frequency in harmonics, the next harmonic above tends to go slightly higher in frequency, so that brings the 10 and 50 meter frequencies back down within a reasonable part of the band. And then towards the other end we've got the load-in and choke coil. The inductance of this is such that on 40 through to 10 meters it acts as a choke and it isolates the right hand side of the antenna. On 80 meters it doesn't act as a choke, it acts as a loading coil, and therefore it extends the frequency of the antenna to cover 80 meters. This means the antenna is physically a lot shorter than it would otherwise be to cover 80 meters. It also means that that end section of the antenna can be adjusted to move the frequency on 80 meters without affecting the other bands. Now here we see two half waves. The top one is a dipole because it's broken in the centre and it presents a low impedance and it's fed with coax cable. The one below is also a half wave long, but it's not broken in the centre, but like the dipole it presents a high impedance at the ends. Now, provided we have a transformer that will match a high impedance, we can feed energy into that end-fed half wave from one end, and at the moment you'll see a little transformer on the left hand side that's designed to match the high impedance of a half wave. Let's suppose in those two antennas we've just looked at were 20 meters long and we were feeding them with 7 megahertz energy. In other words, 20 meters is a half wave on 7 megahertz. Let's double the frequency to 14 megahertz, the next amateur band up. And now let's see what happens, because now we've got effectively two half waves in series. Now I know two half waves make a full wave, but let's stick with the two half waves in series. Those two antennas now appear as two half waves in series because they have been fed with 14 megahertz energy. Let's take a look. The curved line at the top represents the impedance, so we start off with a high impedance, pass through low impedance and then to a high impedance. So the gap at the middle is now high impedance, which means to say we can't feed it with coax cable. It would be a total mismatch. But look at the lower one. The lower one starts off with high impedance and ends up with high impedance, but the difference is that one we can feed with coax because we've got a transformer on the left hand side. So immediately you see that an end-fed half wave is happy to be fed on harmonics, whereas the dipole really collapses on harmonics. It's just impossible to feed it. So this version of the antenna will work on both 7 MHz and 14 MHz, and of course harmonics above that, i.e. 21 and 28 MHz. You begin to see how versatile an end-fed half-wave can be. What you're most interested, I'm sure, is how do I fit this 25 metre length of antenna into my small garden? Well, quite clearly there's a certain amount of bending has to take place, and well, I suppose every so often I get an email or a message from somebody saying, if I bend my antenna this way or that way, will it still work? Well, the answer is yes, it will. You know, there's a myth about bending antennas. If you bend it through more than 50 degrees or 90 degrees, it's not going to work. It's a myth. Of course it will work. Of course it will work. As soon as you bend an antenna, you'll change things slightly. The direction of radiation will change. The polar pattern, the horizontal polar pattern will change a bit. You will either raise or lower the frequency a bit, but of course that can be compensated anyway. But the point is that if you bend an antenna, it is not going to stop it working. Now let me give you an example. I'll give you two examples. In this particular antenna, we've got a loading coil. Now that loading coil is rather like winding the antenna back on itself. It doesn't stop it working. Another form of popular loading is what we call linear loading, where you take the antenna back 180 degrees and then back another 180 degrees in its original direction. So you create a fold in the middle or one point. It's called linear loading. It doesn't stop the antenna working. So this is a myth about you mustn't bend an antenna by so many degrees. It's just not the case. So having got rid of that myth, you can rest assured that there are ways of getting this antenna into your particular garden. Now, I'm going to show you the various options, and you can modify these as you see fit. So let's take a look at the various options you've got. Right, first up on the screen is the inverted V, a familiar arrangement. You can use a metal mast as the centre support there. I've shown it with a fairly steep 90-degree angle at the top, and it creates roughly a 55-foot or so span at the bottom. You can change that angle to suit your garden. I would suggest that you keep the ends of the antenna around about a metre above ground, but otherwise this works extremely well actually, and it's an arrangement I've used for a few months, about a year or so ago. The inverted L is another traditional arrangement, and it's quite an interesting arrangement because the vertical section may give you some lower angle radiation that you may not get with a low horizontal arrangement. The actual vertical section can be any length you like. I've shown it as 25 feet in order to make the maths quite simple. But if you make that vertical section longer, obviously the horizontal section reduces and so forth. But it's an arrangement that will work. And again, just keep that bottom transformer around a metre above ground. Here's another arrangement of the inverted L. This time it's sort of a reversal, but again the benefits are the same, and you've got the flexibility of adjusting the vertical length to enable you to fit the horizontal section in the garden. Now here's a very interesting arrangement because it enables you to fit the antenna into a very small garden actually. 25-foot vertical either end and a 25-foot top section. And as usual, these dimensions are not rigid. You can change them to suit your own personal location. I would say that the vertical sections need to be kept clear of metalwork. When I say kept clear, about a metre or so should be more than adequate. I should perhaps add that all these drawings are with the ground at the bottom of the drawing, but there's no reason why you can't bend the antennas in the horizontal plane rather than the vertical plane. But I think the message is, of course, that the whole thing is highly flexible, and don't be frightened of bending the antenna to fit the garden. Adjusting the antenna is pretty simple actually. You'll probably find the antenna is almost resonant at where you expect it to be. If it happens to be resonant too low, and that's the most likely scenario, then you need to shorten it slightly. Remember that if you shorten the main section, in other words the bit that covers 40 to 10 meters, if you shorten that, you'll raise the frequency, and if you use 40 meters as the reference point, then if you shorten it so that it's resonant on 7.1 megahertz, for example, it will also be resonant on 14.2, and you can work it up for yourself on the harmonic. So do remember that whatever you do on 40 meters will affect the other bands. On the 80 meter band, which is the bit beyond that loading coil, you can make the adjustments on its own. It won't affect the rest of the antenna. And on that, you really want to decide where you're going to operate. Probably 3.7 megahertz is not a bad point to have it resonant at. I found that the end-fed half wave seemed to have a slightly broader bandwidth than a dipole. And if you've got an internal ATU in your transceiver, you should find that you don't have any problems at all in matching. In fact, you should find that you can actually use the antenna without the ATU, but I would suggest you put the ATU in for two reasons. First of all, you might as well use it and get the matching as close as you possibly can. And secondly, on 80 meters, when you're moving about, because it's a fairly broad band, you will find that the SWR will rise as you go away from the resonant frequency, and having the ATU in will help. But you shouldn't need an external ATU, which is another advantage of the end-fed half wave. So don't be discouraged if you've got a small garden. You can make it work. It's a challenge, it's great fun, and I've operated from small gardens. I mean, I've been licensed for 60 years now, so I've used many antennas and an awful lot of wire antennas, and I know that it doesn't matter how small the garden is, you can usually get something to work, and that's part of the challenge. And do remember that you can work a lot of DX with a wire antenna. You just got to be a bit patient, wait for the band conditions to turn in your favour, and you'll have some great fun. So there we are, that's the Vibraplex. Well, I'm not going to repeat the model number again. I think I got it wrong at the beginning. Anyway, that's the Vibraplex antenna for you. It's well made, nice antenna, and if you want something simple that will work in a small garden and that will give you multi-band operation and be very easy on the eye, in other words, there's nothing hanging around at all, it's a good choice. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed this video. I've tried to make it as informative as I can. Do remember that, you know, although we are a commercial company selling radios, I think it's part of our job also to help newcomers or those that haven't got much experience in antennas, to help them to enjoy the hobby, because, you know, it is a hobby business, and it does reflect. I get quite a few messages from people saying how much they enjoy the videos, and we're surprised you don't sell more. Well, we don't push selling in these videos because the videos are really try to be helpful and perhaps in some small way tutorial. If you want to know what we sell, you can go onto our website. We don't have to tell you how good it is or etc, etc. You probably read a lot about them anyway. So we're not the sort of pushy site that pushes products. We will talk about a product and then try to tell you why we think it might be suitable for you. There we are, that's the way we work. So in the meantime, enjoy your hobby, keep safe, and appreciate you keep watching these videos. Don't forget to press the subscribe button, and if you've got any friends or clubs that want to have a look at these videos, just send them a link and they can join in the fun. And it's also, by the way, quite interesting. Some of the comments we get are quite interesting, because rest assured that it's not only us that read your comments, they are public comments, so other people will read them as well. So it's keeping it in the family. So let's finish as we started. I haven't got a bow tie. I'm sure they wore a bow tie when they said this. London calling. Well, perhaps I should stick to my day job. Anyway, keep safe, enjoy your hobby, speak soon.